Does a multiverse exist? That's a legitimate scientific question. And if it does that explain all the fine tuning? And what I've found in that is that though it seems like it solves the fine tuning, that the argument for purpose actually shows up even within the multiverse.
Can you unpack that a little bit? I'm joined today by Dr. Zweerink, who, am I right in saying that you just got back from Antarctica?
I did just get back from Antarctica. That is correct.
And that makes me very jealous. So what were you doing down there?
So part of my job, I work over at UCLA as a project scientist, and the particular experiment we're working on is an antimatter detector. And so we're building a detector, want to launch it on a balloon. And so we were down in Antarctica assembling the detector, getting ready for a balloon launch, which hopefully will happen here in later December.
So will that balloon does it have enough lift basically to get outside of the atmosphere on its own without any propulsion, or how does that actually work?
That's correct. It's designed to fly up at 120,000 feet. So 120,000 divided by 5, that's about 25 miles up, somewhere in that range. And you're correct. You fill it up with some amount of helium. It expands. I think it's got 40 million gallons of volume to it. So it's a pretty good sized balloon when it gets up there. I think our detector, all said and done, weighs about 8,000 pounds. And so it's going to launch that up, fly around Antarctica for 30 or 40 days, gathering data while it's doing that.
And you said it's measuring antimatter? That's
what it's designed to detect. Correct.
So what is antimatter, and is it 25 miles above the Earth?
Well, so a little bit more details of what we're looking for there. Antimatter is just for every particle that exists in the world, there's an antiparticle to it. So if you got protons, there's antiprotons. If you got electrons, there's anti-electrons. We call them positrons typically. And so what we're looking for is a particular particle that if you take a proton, which is the center of a hydrogen atom, and if you add a neutron to it, that becomes what's called an antideuteron, or a deuteron. We're looking for the antiparticle of that. And the reason why you have to go up into space is that matter and antimatter, particles and antiparticles, have this property that when they get together, they annihilate into pure energy. So while there may be antiparticles floating around here, they run into particles very quickly and disappear. And so if you get up 120,000 feet up above the atmosphere, those antiparticles can go quite a long distance before they interact. And so that's why we need to be up there so we can actually see them before they get absorbed by something in the atmosphere.
And what hypothesis is being tested, or what, I guess, I'm trying to think of a more scientific way to say it, but what value is being added? What question is being answered? What's the purpose of the whole project?
The purpose of the project is, again, to search for these antideuterons. And if we find a handful of these, 5 to 10 in our experiment, which will last for 30 or 40 days, will take on the order of 1 billion events. But if we find a handful of the ones we're looking for, it will tell us what dark matter is. Because one of the leading candidates for dark matter, we can measure its gravitational interaction. We know dark matter's out there. We suspect it's a kind of particle, but we don't know what kind of particle it is. So we're looking for that. And if it's a certain kind of particle, it's its own antiparticle, so that when it hits another dark matter, it will annihilate into energy, and it has enough energy to produce these antideuterons. And there's virtually no other way to produce antideuterons out in space. So if we find some of these antideuterons in our detector, that will tell us, we now know what dark matter is. And that will be a really cool find if it works out that way.
Wow. So that actually could be a massive find also.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it really is. So, I mean, if we're successful and we find some and somebody verifies it with another experiment, likely the head of our project will get a Nobel Prize. It's that level of discovery if we were to find it.
That's exciting. How long were you down there for?
I was down there for about 3 weeks. So I went down in early November, started working on assembling the detector. There are people still down there working on assembling the detector. pretty much have it put together. We're just in the testing, debugging phase. And hopefully, like I said, we're supposed to fly somewhere or launch the balloon somewhere in late December here. And it'll fly for 30 or 40 days, and then we'll bring it down. And, even once we start launching, we're going to start getting data, but then we'll do a more intense data analysis period trying to figure out what we found and what we haven't found.
When you arrived, were there people down there who were kind of dictating where you would go and would not go? I've heard so much about how Antarctica is sort of like this highly restricted area, and it's like humans are really only allowed in an extremely small part of it. And like, what was your experience in terms of like who was down there, and how did that all go down?
Well, so it's really kind of cool because we're actually on an island. We're at McMurdo Station, which is on Ross Island, and it's a volcanic island. But around the island, it's surrounded by ice. So there would be ocean and a sea around there, but it's all iced over. So our C-17 airplane that we came in on, which is a pretty good sized plane, lands out on the ice. But we were driven in on a road, come into McMurdo Station. It's a small city that's there. I mean, small city, but nonetheless a functioning city in that fashion. We had dorms we could stay in. There's a galley, places to eat, not restaurants, but places to go visit for just to socialize. We were free to walk around the base, could go out on hikes. I went out on a few hikes while we're there. I wouldn't say it's highly restricted and that you can't go anywhere or that they're keeping you from going anywhere. It's just kind of a dangerous place, and there's not a lot of support if you get hurt. And so if you were to break a leg or if you were to get trapped somewhere, it would take a lot of resources to deal with that. And so they're just trying to limit that because we're trying to do science down there rather than go find people who get hurt and take care of them.
You get 15% off everything in the store by joining the Wisdom Society. And we're making the Wisdom Society 30% off between now and the end of the year because I really, really want you guys to join. I want to pull you over the line. I want you to be a part of this because the conversations have been amazing. The book club with special guests like Stephen Meyer has been amazing. Become a premium member today, sign up for the year, get the 30% off, and get a free Wisdom Society members mug. Go to dailydoseofwisdom.com for more details. I hope to see you guys there. Now back to the video.
Another thing I wanted to discuss with you, I don't know if you've seen it or not, or how much YouTube you watch or podcasts you listen to, but Francis Collins recently went on the Alex O'Connor podcast. It got sidetracked onto this idea of, could God have used different constants, different numbers, different mathematical numbers to make a universe?
Let me play just a minute of their conversation here so that you can have the context. Is God constrained by these constants?
He chooses to be.
He chooses to be.
I don't know that in his existence those constants exist. He's not part. He created, but he is not himself part of the created universe.
So this is the thing that sort of confounds me, is that before the universe exists and you just have sort of God up in the ether, and he's sort of thinking about creating this universe, to put it crudely. And for some reason, God is confined to these very narrow restraints, and in fact could not create a life-permitting universe but within those constraints. And and therefore, before this universe is even created, God is in some way constrained by the strong and weak nuclear forces.
I don't understand that at all. You're suggesting that God is part of the creation that God put in place for the universe. God doesn't have to be constrained that way. God is outside of space, outside of time.
Yeah.
Not basically having to adhere to any of such.
I don't mean that God is constrained by those forces, that they're like acting upon him. I mean that he's constrained in the sense that he can only create a material world that abides by those particular constraints.
Oh, I think you could create any material world. I think he wanted to create one that was interesting. And so he made the selection of those equations and those constants in order for it not to just be a big waste of time.
But would it have been impossible for him to create a universe that's life-emitting and just as interesting, in which gravity was stronger?
Well, I don't think it would have been as interesting. God was interested in thought.
But I mean a thought-permitting universe, right? So like a universe where basically everything is the same as it is now. Let's say that the gravity is stronger, but this dark energy that's causing the universe to expand is a bit stronger, or there's some other introduced force, or in other words, when God goes to create the universe, is he constrained in the sense that if he wants to create this thought-permitting universe, that everything has to be so finely balanced?
It seems like I'm missing something, because that doesn't seem to answer the question. I guess that's kind of your point. It didn't seem to land the plane there. Because when I think about fine-tuning, the way I think about it is this way, is that the question I have is, do we see evidence of purpose in the universe? And fine-tuning is one way to argue for that. So, for example, I go out and look at my car, and I find that, lo and behold, every bolt in my car has this kind of specific set of measurements to it. They're not just, if things were not even random, but just left to the way things work under the laws of physics, you would expect this wide mix of them. The fact that they all the bolts and all the nuts seem to line up and they fit perfectly, you could argue that's fine tuning, but it's like these things fit together. They work the way they do to accomplish a purpose, if you will. And so when I think of fine tuning in the universe, that's kind of the way I'm thinking about it, because it's not the question, could it be different? Because I could go through there and use all English bolts on my car, or I could use all metric bolts. There are two different ways to do it, but both of them are fine-tuned because they're still accomplishing something. They're both going towards a goal, if you will. And so that's kind of the question I'm trying to ask when I look at fine-tuning arguments or things that are used for fine-tuning. So you can talk about things, of the examples that just kind of tend to come to my mind is, we know that the universe is expanding, and the expansion rate drives what sort of structure forms in the universe. And one of the things people recognize is that gravity is a much weaker force than the electromagnetic force. So if you take two protons and put them next to each other and ask, how much do they affect each other because of the charge, which is the electromagnetic force, and how much do they affect each other because of the mass, which is the gravitational force? The electromagnetic force is orders of magnitude. It's like 10, a trillion, trillions, so it's enormously larger. Well, that means now that if we're talking about the expansion of the universe, gravity is what largely drives the expansion of the universe. If it were true that there were more protons than electrons in the universe, or more electrons than protons, then you can now, so you consider that scenario, you can now ask, how much more would it need to be before it started dominating the expansion of the universe? And it turns out it's a really small number, because electromagnetism is so much stronger. In fact, if the amount of charge, the number of protons and the number of electrons were not the same to 1 part in 10 to the 37, then electromagnetism would drive the expansion of the universe, and it would drive it so rapidly that you wouldn't get structures formed in the universe. So that's an example of fine-tuning, that the number of positive charge and the number of negative charge, and so it's not even just restricted to electrons and protons, it's just positive and negative charge. Turns out that needs to be fine-tuned to a very small amount. So that's an interesting thing to show up. Is that important to life being here? It turns out it's very important to life being here. But then I also have to ask the question, is that what I would expect naturally to happen? And it turns out that when you go in and look at the physics, lo and behold, one of the things that drives physicists is symmetry. That, we talk about conservation laws like conservation of energy or conservation of mass or whatever. All of those are a result of some fundamental symmetry in the universe. Well, there's also a symmetry that says having zero charge is a very symmetric thing. And so there's conservation of charge, and that's related to some symmetry. So here I've got this property, which is very important to life, seems to be incredibly fine-tuned, but in this particular instance, I have a good reason to physically expect it to be that way. So I give this this kind of detailed description of this to show what are some of the things that we need to look at that when we're arguing for fine tuning. One, does it take on a pretty specific value? Is that value important to life? And is there a good natural explanation for it? And so if it's not a particularly weird value, then it's probably not fine-tuned. If it's not important to life, it's probably not fine-tuned. And if there's a good explanation for it, natural explanation for it, it may not be fine-tuned also. And so why I think fine-tuning actually exists, though, is that there are numbers of things we can point to. And it seems like the more we understand about the universe, the more we see this fine-tuning show up. So to me, that's a signature that there's something really going on there. And I'll give you one example where that plays out. We look at the expansion rate of the universe. If it's much faster, then all the stuff in the universe gets spread too uniformly. You don't have the large-scale structure that allows places where life can exist to form. If it happens more slowly, you get very dense structures and you mostly get black holes. And so either one of those scenarios doesn't work. And so you can actually do calculations and show that if the mass density was 1 part in 60 larger or smaller very early in the universe, the expansion would either be too fast or too slow for life to exist. So here you've got a scenario where you've got this value that takes on a very narrow range. It's incredibly important to life and seems to have no explanation. Well, that is until kind of the late 1980s, early 90s, where we realized that inflation happened in our universe. And inflation actually drives that value very close to what it needs for the expansion rate of the universe. So it seems like we've gotten rid of the fine-tuning by understanding more, until you go in and look at how inflation happens. And to get inflation to work requires this real convoluted potential. So inflation requires a whole bunch of fine-tuning to work. So this now reminds me of those little balloon tubes that were filled with water. It's like you got them in your hand and you try and squeeze it. And I'm like, okay, I can squeeze it and make it smaller, except it kind of pops out your hand one way or the other. If you we have this stuff that is, it looks like it's a weird value. It's critical to life. And we seem to have scientific events say, okay, no, it really isn't. And we've gotten rid of the fine tuning and then it pops up bigger somewhere else. That process has repeatedly gone on as we've investigated fine tuning. And so that's why I think it's a real effect. It's like something's really there because this universe needs to have certain constraints or else life's not going to exist. No, there's not a lot of there are not a lot of options you can have in a universe that actually permits life. And the more we know about life, it seems like the more constraints there are on what the universe must behave. That seems to make the evidence for the fine-tuning stronger, which points to the universe being here for a purpose. And I think that's what the fine-tuning argument really does, is illuminates that there's a purpose to the universe.
That's really helpful. And as a follow-up to that, am I right in my understanding that if not for going into the multiverse hypothesis, there's only one at bat, right? There's only one Big Bang and everything else happening that, in other words, all of this is so precisely as it is, and there was only one opportunity for that all to dial in perfectly. Is that the general idea? Or so, in other words, is the reason that the multiverse hypothesis exists as a response to saying, well, what if there was a bunch of opportunities that then, based on probability, created this one dialed in scenario? But apart from the multiverse, am I right in my understanding that I'm talking just science, that it's like, there's one Big Bang that includes all of this fine tuning, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
No, that is right in that, if you go to the late 80s, early 90s, that in that range, 60s, 70s, 80s, it's like there's one universe. And so that's why how did life get here was such a fascinating problem, is because given the one shot we had at it, life seems really weird. How did it get here? How do we explain it? So that is correct. Now, what I would say is this: it's not like scientists were going along saying, boy, it'd be really nice if we had a lot of opportunities. How could we develop a model that allows us to have that? it actually was driven the other way around. Scientists recognized that if there were a lot of opportunities, that would explain, you could use that to potentially explain the fine-tuning. But what ultimately happened was they're saying, all right, how do we explain the universe? There are these features of the universe that are hard to explain given our standard Big Bang cosmological picture. And what scientists recognize is that if our universe underwent a period of inflation very early in its history, it would explain many of those features, stuff about magnetic monopoles, the geometry of the universe, the temperature of the cosmic microwave background. All of these things a period of inflation would explain. And then they started saying, okay, is there evidence for inflation? And lo and behold, I think there's pretty strong evidence that inflation happened. And then they asked the question, okay, how does inflation happen? How do we understand the mechanism behind inflation? And it's when they started understanding the mechanism behind inflation, which at that point in time had a lot of scientific, I don't want to say it was demonstrated, but it had a lot of evidence in its support. When they started investigating, it's like, wait a second, if inflation works, it seems to produce a multiverse. And so it wasn't like, again, I just want to emphasize that scientists didn't think, well, we need a lot of universes. How can we do that? It was, let's try and understand this universe. And inflation happened. And as we're looking at inflation, maybe the multiverse actually, so we might live in a multiverse. So it was, we just, we don't get to stand back and say, scientists just invented the multiverse to get around all this evidence for fine tuning. They were really trying to understand the universe better. And it seems like that's a very good and plausible explanation for the best explanation of our universe. So now I got to ask the question, okay, so does a multiverse exist? That's a legitimate scientific question. And if it does that explain all the fine tuning? And what I've found in that is that though it seems like it solves the fine tuning, that the argument for purpose actually shows up even within the multiverse.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
So I'll go back to a point you made there where, if this is the only universe we have, we now have to explain how do you get life when this is the only shot? It seems very improbable, and the improbability of life made it hard to explain. Mm-hmm. Now you look at so if the multiverse exists and it's the explanation for life, what's the explanation that it's basically given? Okay, yes, life requires this rare set of circumstances, improbable set of circumstances to come about. The multiverse basically says everything that can happen happens, and life just shows up because it's one of those possibilities that can happen. That's basically the naturalistic multiverse explanation of life here on Earth. Now you have this question. Okay, wait a second. If everything that can happen does happen, I need to ask the question, is this the only way life shows up? Because we think life is arrangement of atoms and it just all shows up, whether, some evolutionary process, it starts early and life grows, it's rare, it's incredibly improbable, but that's the way it happens. Well, as scientists think, that's not the only way you can get life. You could get life, maybe once life starts somewhere, life advances to a place where these creatures can create universes with simulated life. Mm-hmm. And so we now have to ask the question, are we actually the life that is the production of this evolutionary process, naturalistic evolutionary process, or are we part of some advanced civilization simulation? How do we tell the difference between those two? An even more bizarre idea is that, again, if life is just an arrangement of atoms, well, you get thermal fluctuations in this is basic thermodynamics, that you have your background and then you got these fluctuations. Well, you can have fluctuations where the right number of atoms comes into place and you get a brain and Jeff Zweernick goes, I'm here, and then poofs out of existence. Incredibly rare, but again, look at how the multiverse explains life. Everything that can happen does happen. So as rare and improbable as this brain fluctuating into existence, it happens in the multiverse. Are we one of those brains, or are we this history? And when you begin to delve in and ask the question, how do we address, are we a simulation? Are we this evolutionary outcome? Are we a Boltzmann brain? Well, the only one that explains how science works is if we're this evolutionary history. And it turns out most ways of trying to account which one's most probable, this evolutionary history, are the ones that are improbable. Well, things that are improbable might be fine-tuning and pointing to purpose. And so even in the multiverse, because you now have to deal with every way life could come up, it looks like we're a rare kind of life. And that still has that, we're atypical, we're unusual. That points to purpose and fine-tuning. So even in the multiverse, the naturalistic multiverse, I will say, you still get a fine-tuning or a teleological argument where there's purpose. There's a reason why this is all played out this way.
So what do you think are the biggest obstacles within all of this for someone buying into the God hypothesis? Because that's, I know, kind of the elephant in the room here, is we're essentially saying, hey, purpose means there's a purposer, and design means there's a designer. Obviously I'm a believer for not just for these types of reasons, although that definitely helps, but for a number of reasons. So, but I always put myself in the shoes of the person who just being intelligent being, answer to these questions about all these topics. It just seems like such an insurmountable obstacle for some people, and I'm always trying to understand what that is. And so, what do you think is going on there? I'm not leading this question in any way. I'm trying to. Because it's no longer a scientific answer, I guess. But anyways, you're essentially saying we see the markers of intentionality, we see the markers of purpose, we see mathematically something that it's like, wow. I mean, how lucky can you get until it's not luck? And also, a lot of other things, right? Like the fact that we can perceive beauty, the fact that we have consciousness. There's just a lot of things that kind of make sense in the being scenario. But why is that such a hard pill to swallow for some and not for others? I guess is my question.
I think that question probably has more answers than there are people on the earth, if I would.
Sure.
But I do think I've at least seen a few different classes to that. I think there are some who perceive that the moment you start introducing an intelligent being into scientific discussions, that's just a cop-out and you're not wanting to do the hard work of trying to understand how the universe works. And so there's this belief, somewhat justified, that Christians use God to get around doing the hard work of trying to understand how the universe works. And being a scientist, I know how much fun doing science is. And so the moment you come in and say, well, God did it, I just have to accept it, I'm like, yeah, I don't like that. So I think there's some of it where how Christians have portrayed how science works has been a detriment to that.
Swiss AI Jesus project to bridge digital and divine draws users' praise as questions remain. Now, I know that's a hard pivot, but stick with me for just 60 seconds here. You guys have heard me talk in the past about Ground News. They're an app and website that combines news from local and international sources around the world, as well as how different stories are being covered. For example, if you type in Jesus in the search bar, you can see there's 1,626 recent stories that hit that search term. And you can also see the top story right away, which is the title that I just read about this AI Jesus. So let's just use this story as an example to see how this works. This story has been covered 58 times so far. The bias distribution is 27% left-leaning coverage, 62 center, and 11 right-leaning coverage, which is actually kind of surprising because it looks like the story is actually a blind spot for the right, since only 11% of coverage comes from right-leaning outlets. So if you mainly read right-leaning publications, you may have actually missed this bizarre story. All right, so let's compare the coverage. How do the headlines compare? The left seems to emphasize technological capabilities and the inclusivity of AI Jesus, such as its multilingual communication, whereas the right questions the broader societal implications of blending the so-called digital and the divine. What I love about Ground News and why I continue to work with them is that they help you stay informed on the topics you care about from sources you trust, while still highlighting blind spots in reporting and exposing media bias. So sign up through this QR code or use my link in the description for 50% off this unlimited access plan. It's their biggest discount of the year, whether it's for yourself or as a gift. I think that they're doing important work, especially in this weird cultural moment where it seems like truth is a harder thing than ever to actually get to the bottom of. So check out Ground News. Think for yourself. Now back to the interview.
Many skeptics I've met would like to portray that, oh, clearly the evidence points to God doesn't exist. And many Christians who would like to portray, and if you think that God exists, you're being irrational. And many Christians portray, oh, the evidence is so compelling towards God that it's so clear that he exists. And if you don't believe in God, you're being irrational. And it leaves this dichotomy that I don't really fall into either of those, that I really do think there's a lot of evidence that points to God's existence. But I can also understand how someone could look and say, you know what, there's a lot of evidence there, but there's some uncertainty, and I think it's still an open question. And if somebody were to treat that like that was an unhonest question, I would quit listening to you, because it just says you don't really understand. You're kind of dismissing the actual struggles and thoughts and intellectual and social wrestling that I'm doing here. And so I think there's some people in that category. I would put myself I tend to be in that kind of middle range of, I think there's strong evidence for, but I could see why it's not compelling to certain people. And I actually think, scripturally speaking, that's the way the Bible describes things. I mean, when you think about it, if the Bible is correct, and I'm convinced it is, you've got the second person of the Godhead in human form walking on the earth, and people still didn't believe he was God. So I mean, there can't be any better evidence than that in some sense. And so I don't think we're ever going to prove that God does exist, and I don't think it will ever be proved that God doesn't exist. There's data. If you want evidence to believe that God exists, there's an abundance of evidence, but it's not something that compels you to do that or be irrational. And then I think there are also some people who just have been hurt by people in the church, or bad family environments, or they don't understand how there could be all this suffering in the world. There are genuine intellectual arguments that they don't have answers to. There are emotional, relational issues that they've been hurt. I think, like I said, the number of reasons could span the spectrum. And so that's why, as in my personal interactions with people, I'm less concerned with how do I get these arguments in line so when I encounter someone who doesn't believe in God, I can present this great case. I'm saying, all right, I need to know how to present Christianity well, but then I want to know, who are you? What's going on with you? What are your real questions? Often people will bring up questions like, yeah, I wrestle with that too. So it's a relational approach of wanting to know where they are. And ultimately the question I'm asking is, okay, God, how are you working in this person's life? So convince you that a multiverse doesn't exist so that we can talk about Christianity. Well, that's going to be a really stilted conversation. But if you're interested in, how could there not be alien life out there? Well, let's have a discussion. And how can I bring my Christian view into that, present it to you, let you think about and ponder it, and ultimately recognize that it's the Spirit's work in your life that is going to ultimately do that work that convinces you one way or the other.
That makes a lot of sense. I also think, well, let me just ask you, why do you want people to be Christian?
Because I think that is who they're designed to be. We are, again, I think there's an abundance of evidence that Scripture is correct, and Scripture reveals that the God, the creator of the universe, the Father who eternally begat the Son, that the Spirit proceeds from, that love that God the Father shows to the Son overflows through the Spirit to us, that he's inviting us into that relationship, that's what we're designed for. I want people to know that. Some people may not want that. They reject. That's their call, not my call. I want people to know that. And I want people to know that in doing that, that's where they're designed. One, they'll have eternal life. But two, even in this life, it's the way to live that is truly fulfilling and satisfying. That's what I want people to know.
Yeah. I think that that's important, because I feel that it can often be misunderstood as just like Christians want to just like win the chess game of the conversation and have succeeded in convincing the other person that God is real, and then have the ego boost of that, or the just gratification of having changed someone's mind. But I think what you said is so important that I forget the reference to it, but there's a verse in scripture that talks about basically the role of love in all of this. Mm-hmm. They'll know that you're my disciples if you love one another.
Right.
And that might sound hippie-ish, but I think it's important for people to know that it's that there is a love that's fueling the effort. Mm-hmm. And I love what you said too about how for different people, the roadblock to belief is going to look a little bit different. And so it's like, you want to talk multiverse, let's talk multiverse. If you want to talk aliens, let's talk aliens. But the idea of that the shape of the conversation should be particularized to where the individual person is at. That's one of the things that's so hard about a public discussion like this. It's like, I don't know, half of what's being said is probably triggering some people and maybe it's like helping some other people. It's always so difficult. But so we've hit on some of the science, but I also I've seen some of your videos that deal with Aquinas's 5 ways, which I think is really cool. And that's something that not a lot of people talk about as much anymore. But I do think that there's a bit of value in that more sort of philosophical approach to things. Is that something that you are comfortable going into on the fly here, like kind of breaking down some of Aquinas's Summa Theologica stuff?
I can talk a little bit about it. I mean, there's a reason I went into astrophysics and not philosophy, because
fair enough.
One fascinates me far more than the other. I do really like philosophy and I like learning about it, but my interest in I have done some reading, not so much in the Summa Theologica, but in interacting with some of our visiting scholars here at Reasons to Believe have a interest in that, and so I have interacted with that because I think the way the scientific discussion plays out about the discussion of whether God exists is a philosophically kind of small version that what Aquinas' insights into how to think about things and what the ancient philosophers were thinking about was a more fully orbed discussion of existence instead of just the material stuff. And that's what I found pretty interesting about Aquinas and Aristotle's way of their philosophy behind that.
Can you unpack then just that a little bit? Because even as you're saying that, I think I know what you mean, but I am interested to learn more about just that piece. We don't have to do a whole deep dive into all 5 and all that, but just in terms of maybe it's just a matter of helping to show some contrast between, like you said, kind of their way of viewing reality versus maybe the way that some sort of post-Enlightenment perceptions of reality are.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that stood out to me, and again, I was having this discussion with people who are far more versed in Thomistic philosophy, but that we look at things today, we talk about causes, and they're almost always material causes. The material, what would be in Aristotle's term, there were 4 different types of causes. There was the material cause, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. And if I got what was being said there, it's like to understand something, you need to understand all those causes. So you could talk about why does Jeff Zweernick exist, or why was the pot boiling? You can talk about the material causes. Well, there's atoms that are moving in there, and the average kinetic energy increase, that would be today's language we would use for that, increase to a certain point, that the vapor pressure, the water transition from a liquid to a vapor form, and so that would be what are going on with the material in it. And then there's the efficient causes of, well, the teapot is sitting on top of the stove was on, the gas was burning, that's what was causing the molecules to heat up. So now we've got an efficiency cause, or the physical chain of cause, if you will, there. But what that misses is that there's also a formal cause and a final cause. And what I understand in that explanation there is that there's a formal cause in that water molecules, when they get hotter, they behave in a certain way. And it's not like there is no other option. It's like if water goes from here to here, it gets hotter. These are the way it behaves. In fact, if you were to pour water over certain types of materials, it always dissolves this way in these conditions. And so there's not this randomness to it. It's like it always works this way. There's a form of what boiling water is supposed to be, if you will. And it's kind of described in some of the material and efficient causes, but it's something more than that. And that's kind of more illustrated when you talk about, like a sodium and a chlorine atom. Sodium has a certain set of properties, chlorine has a certain set of properties. And it's not like sodium chloride is a mixture of those properties that when they get together, this thing has an entirely different form to it, if you will. And so you can talk about formal causes, and then there's the final cause of, it's like, where is this all going? What's it going to? Well, the reason why, the final cause of the teapot is that somebody's making tea, And so the interesting part of that discussion was that came out in the discussion I was thinking with this philosophers. He said that when natural philosophers finally said, we're not going to worry about final and formal causes, we're just going to look at the material and efficient causes, that's when science really began to make progress. And it kind of makes sense, because what you're now doing there is saying we're not going to look at the kind of immaterial things. We're going to look at the matter and how it behaves. Those are the things that we can do and measure and control and quantify. And that's where science began to take off. I just found that interesting that now you come back hundreds of years later and we're saying, well, science, which has restricted itself to the material and the efficient causes, is now saying, we know the explanation for everything. We know why the universe exists and that there's no God. If you look at the trajectory, it was like, okay, to explain everything, we needed to know not only the material and the efficient causes, but we needed to know the final and the formal causes. We're going to exclude those so that we can study things here. We're going to get to there, and now we can rule out that there's a final and a formal cause. It's just an interesting chain of logic to me that, because of restricting ourselves philosophically, we were able to advance scientifically. Those advances scientifically are now leading us to conclude that those original we shouldn't have to worry about anyway. Because I think to really get a good understanding, you need to understand the final and the formal cause also.
That's really helpful. And I think that a part of that is highlighting that those causes are non-competitive. They're not, it's not one or the other or the other. They're all working together to give a complete answer, basically. And so to your point about why is the water boiling, which I love Dr. John Lennox, who talks about that as well. He's like, it's boiling for the materialistic reason, and we can explain scientifically why, and the other reasons that you just went into, and then also because I wanted a cup of tea. Right. Like that's a part of the answer. Does this play into, because it's just so funny how often anytime that there's a case for God made, or, and intelligent design is given as an explanation for some reality that we're looking at, God of the gaps without fail comes out. And I see it in the comments, that's argument from ignorance, God of the gaps. But is what you're saying about the different causes that each in different ways explain a phenomenon, a part of answering why labeling certain things as God of the gaps is actually wrong, namely because it begins with the end in mind. Basically, it a priori says only material explanations are valid. The fact that you wanted a cup of tea is not a material explanation. Therefore, you're saying, you of the gaps as an explanation for why the water is boiling. If you follow what I'm saying, could you kind of tie this into, just because it really feels like a catch-all for me. If it feels like just one of those phrases that people have learned, and they're like, whatever, anytime I hear God, I respond with God of the gaps. And I just sense that there's not a lot of thought going into that. And so I kind of want to just tease out, what would be a valid instance in which we could label something and say, that is a God of the gaps argument, or that is an argument from ignorance, but then this would not be. And so I just want to help people think through that, because again, I think it's something that it's like a tool that people have learned, like a vocab word that people have learned. And I see it get used correctly sometimes and incorrectly very often.
Well, the immediate thought that comes to mind as you're asking that question, I actually had a number of immediate thoughts, but I just remember a piece of counsel that a wise pastor once gave to me when we were talking about, I was interested in going into apologetics, and we were talking about that. And he made a statement to me that I've not forgotten over the last 30 plus years. He says, before you argue against a position, make sure you understand it well enough to argue for it. And I think what you're getting at relates to a lot of that. It's like, okay, here's something, I can just throw this argument into it without actually understanding what the person's saying. And so, I would love it if everybody approached things that way. I don't get that luxury, but I can go at things and try and approach it that way. And so, if somebody came along and said, oh, that's just God of the gaps, I think my question would be, oh, okay, what do you mean by that? How am I applying God of the gaps? Is it just because I said, hey, I'm bringing a God into the equation? That's a kind of a bad way to argue it. If I'm saying, well, we don't understand this, so therefore I'm injecting God, then it's actually a legitimate God of the gaps. And so they may see in me a flaw in my reasoning that I'm not seeing. And so just trying to understand, what is it that you're arguing here? Why do you think I'm arguing a God of the gaps? Because what I would contend, at least a lot of the ways that I try and approach an argument for fine-tuning, it's not, well, we don't understand this, so therefore God. It's like, well, here's the argument. Here's how it applies to why I think it points to life. Here's where a naturalistic explanation. I'm trying to get as much data into that as I can. And then once I have as much data and evidence and what we do know, then I step back and say, okay, what's the best explanation for this? And I just find that as I'm looking, the more we know about the universe, the more I see evidence for God, for a designer popping up. You look at how water works and how carbon works, which are fascinating elements and molecules. They're not, so it could just be that carbon, we use water and we use carbon because that's what life adapted to. But you go in and you study and it's like, carbon's ability to form molecules is unlike any other element in the periodic, or any other combination of elements in the periodic table. And water's ability to maintain heat, transmit heat, absorb heat, allow chemical reactions to occur, what it can do, again, it's a molecule that is unlike any other liquid molecule. And so those are fascinating things. But now you say, all right, well, okay, given Big Bang cosmology, how would you expect the elements to be existent? You'd expect, based on how things happen in the early universe, that you'd have hydrogen would be the most abundant, and then helium, because it's the next most massive, and then lithium, because that's the next most abundant element, and then beryllium and boron and lo and behold, when we look at our universe, the most abundant elements in the universe are hydrogen, that matches, helium, that also matches because of the way it's formed, but the next most abundant elements are carbon and oxygen, which are what you need for life. So it's not that I'm saying, well, wow, carbon's so unique, must be God created that way, therefore God exists. It's like, no, okay, we understand how carbon works, and the more we understand, we see how remarkable of an element it is. And we look at oxygen and hydrogen, and we see how water behaves, and we see the more we study, we see its remarkable characteristics. And then we look at how the universe formed, and the universe is structured, the laws of physics are structured in a certain way that assures that carbon and hydrogen and oxygen are the three most abundant reactive elements in the universe. Helium is not reactive. This is building a case that it all fits together. The more we understand, the more it looks like it's fine-tuned. And so that's where I think just asking the question, so why do you think, how is this a God of the gaps argument? Is it just a God of the gaps because I'm bringing in an intelligent designer? Mm-hmm. Trying to figure out what they're actually saying and what they're thinking there. And then also making sure that I'm applying what we know, not what we don't know, to make an argument for God. I think those are the two things that I really try and do when interacting with the question you just raised there.
That's helpful. So like the analogy that I've given, I want to run this by you to see if I'm, because I've said this a few times on the channel. I want to make sure that in light of what you just said, the way that I have articulated this is something that you think is right, basically, which is, and actually I got this original analogy from Frank Turek at one point, kind of talks about this, where, there's the alphabet cereal that has all the letters, and the kid comes home from school and the cereal spells out, I've run to the grocery store, I'll be back in an hour, love you, mom, right? And so, but if you, I guess it's like the most intuitive answer to that data is that your mom left you that message. But if you begin by saying that there is no mom at all, if you just say there is no mom to begin with, then you're forced to say there must have been an earthquake or there must have been something else that generated those letters in that order. And so by default, it's a mom of the gaps argument to say mom did it. Because you began by saying there's no mom for sure. Like there's definitely no mom. So then therefore it is a mom of the gaps argument to say we don't know because we didn't see mom do it, but we think it's probably mom.
Yeah.
Is that the same thing as what you're saying?
It's very similar, yes. And I would just kind of add in there, it's like, so if you're a kid, do you have reason to expect that mom exists? Well, if you have other data that says mom exists, then mom writing the words in the cereal, that would strengthen the case for it. But, if mom exists and mom hates making messes and leaving food on the table, that would be evidence against mom doing that. And so it's really just kind of asking the question, if you just say, all right, I just want to explain this, I've got to exclude, I can exclude mom existing, I can exclude other evidence, you're going to likely end up in some sort of argument for the gaps of something because you're excluding evidence. And so I think it's just really important we ask, what is the evidence pointing towards it? If I'm just positing something with no evidence except this looks weird, that's a whatever of the gaps argument. But if I'm excluding it because I don't like the outcome, I'm doing exactly the same thing. And I think it's much more related to what are we inclined or wanting to believe? Anytime I want to believe something, I should ask myself, okay, I'm wanting to believe this. Does the evidence really support it? Or am I just inclined to believe it? And I think it's fair to challenge the person who's on the other side of that. Are you just getting that because that's the conclusion you want? Or does the evidence really say? So let's lay out the evidence and see if we can find some objective way to agree on how we're going to evaluate what the best explanation is.
Yeah, maybe going back to aliens for a second, maybe this is a better one since let's say we don't have physical evidence of aliens, but if we did, travel to a planet in a different, galaxy in the future, and we found a space station with a bunch of spacecraft and operational computers and everything else, but we didn't see any aliens. It's like kind of the question is like, is it at least logical to think that maybe there are aliens responsible for this space station and all, right? Is that the same idea that we're looking at that and we're saying, it appears to have some intentionality and design features to it. It appears to be a functional, operational space station. We have zero physical evidence of these aliens. Yeah. But we're at least including that as a possibility in the realm of possibilities that aliens might have had something to do with the space station, rather than not including it from the get-go. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
It is. And I guess I would say the moment we've traveled someone else, that removes that entire first argument I had against the being aliens. Because if we can travel somewhere, it's very reasonable to assume that somebody could travel back. But I would put it just in ours. If we found out that there were what appeared to be the wreckage of spacecraft on the moon, if we found
the moon is a better example because we can actually,
So again, you're always asking the question. I think it's highly improbable based on what I know of physics. But one thing is true of physics is that data trumps theory every time. If the data says this is what it is and the theory says it can't, the theory's wrong, not the data. So if, what I find, why I find the data for UFOs or UAPs unconvincing that it's aliens is that the data that's there is the kind of stuff I would expect given where we live. We see things that their spacecraft look remarkably like what ours would. They may move in occasionally weird ways, but they're always kind of right at the boundary of our technology. They're always fuzzy. It's like if aliens were really that alien, or if they were really that technological advanced, why can't are they really just trying to hide from us all the time? Because that's what they would have to be doing. There's nothing about humanity says that we can go somewhere and hide all the time and do it well. So there's just a lot of evidence stacked up in front of it. But if I've started seeing clear evidence of something that transcends what I would expect from human, what we can human technologically do, then the data would force me to say, okay, the physics is strongly against this, but the data says I need to reevaluate what's going on here. And so I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is that there can be evidence that's not, I don't have complete full evidence, but there's things that say I need to have a bigger picture than what I might originally think.
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't mean to throw you off by, I didn't mean like interstellar space travel. Like I was saying like just the moon or Mars, but basically if you see basically like the markers of like, if you see like architecture and spaceships and computers and things like that, it's like, there's only a couple scenarios, right? Like it's either naturally created. It was like a really amazing tornado that just generated a space station, or humans had actually been there in the past and we didn't know it, but we are responsible for that space station that we're looking at, or there actually is something else that is not human that made that space station. And all that I was trying to say is that basically, I think it's just silly to not include the possibility of some intelligent design when you see intelligent design. It was basically where I was trying to go with that. Like, don't begin by saying that's not possible when you're faced with, like you said, data or something actually physical that you're looking at. Like I'm thinking about the information inside of the cell, or, some of these things that it's just like, I think we should be open to all possibilities because we're facing something that appears to be designed.
I agree. And, I would say, especially when you're looking at things inside the cell and the way the earth works, there's some of that you can say, well, that's just the way the laws of physics work. I think there is a lot to that argument. But there's a number of places where it seems like the technology that's in the cell, that's in life, that's in the earth are far beyond anything we can do. And if we were to go somewhere else and somebody says, look what I created, you'd look at the cell and say, oh, that is so far beyond what we can do. But yet, when we're having this discussion in the context of does God exist? And I get other creatures and God they're different classes of explanation. I will just readily say that. But the sophistication of how life works, by analogy from what we can do, seems to point to a mind so beyond what we're capable of that it's at least reasonable to include that in there. And I do kind of wonder how much that's just a response to Christians have, whether rightly or wrongly, been perceived as saying, well, the Bible says it, so I don't have to look at the science. And I think we just have to, as Christians, recognize that we haven't always handled that well, at least not in some of the public vocal ways it's happened. And I think that's a legitimate reason why people might be a little hesitant to go that way.
I think that's such a good point. And it's basically the idea about there's baggage. And I think that you're right. We've created some of it. Believers have created some of it. I think it comes from other locations as well. Mm-hmm. But there is real baggage that has to be dealt with, and almost like an apology that needs to be made. Sorry if we weren't critical thinkers because we were too married to a particular interpretation of this that we felt like had to then be wielded in some way against what was being observed naturally. Like that was a mistake, to the extent that did happen. So, man, I could keep going. What's the I always try to end interviews with, what question have I not asked that I should? What should we be talking about that we haven't yet? So as we're landing the plane here, I guess I'll just open that up to you. Is there anything that, you want to add on top of this, a cherry on top, a last thought, or anything of that nature?
I've enjoyed our conversation thoroughly. We've hit a lot of really important good.
I know.
I'm sitting here trying to think, is there anything I would love to say that we've missed? And I think the only part that I would add, or something I would like to comment, is that I have found, just as by my nature, I tend to be a fairly questioning person. It's like, if somebody comes and challenges me, your position's wrong, I got to be honest. My first response is, no, it's not. And I'm ready. Hackles get up, set the feet. Let's get ready to battle here. Whether I know I'm wrong or right, that's just my default response is when somebody aggressively approaches me. And so I've kind of thought about that if I do that is that kind of representative of people? And I don't think anybody likes to be told they're wrong or even shown they're wrong sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of my thought in how do I deal with science apologetics, talking to people about the gospel, is trying to ask the question, what can I do to smooth the way, if you will? I look at when I change my mind, most of the time it's not because somebody's presented overwhelming evidence. It's because they've done something that has caused me to think, why do I believe what I do? And so, if you come and say, hey, I can show you that God doesn't exist, we're going to have a fight unless I decide to step back and say, I'm not going to do that. But if somebody gets me talking about, why do you think God exists? Well, now I'm thinking about the reasons in my mind and trying to evaluate, are they good or not? And I think that's just what I try and do when I'm talking to people, is not, here's all the evidence, how do you explain it? It's like, how can we have a conversation? Where might there be barriers that are up? Where's things that, that I can engage and be a part of what's going on, to empathize with you? There's just so many places where people misunderstand Christianity and what it's really about. That I've just come to the conclusion that God is never offended at an honest question. If that was true, Jesus would have responded very differently to John the Baptist. But when John asked a question, he said, hey, go look at what the evidence says. And so as a scientist, I love that aspect of it. I don't have to say, I've got to have all the answers. And when somebody comes at me and I have a question, I'm like, okay, how do I go about investigating that? What am I going to be fine? And I've done that enough times that I am supremely confident that no matter what the question, what the challenge, as I go in and explore what does the science really say and what does Christianity really say, that those two are always going to line up at the end. Because if God is the author of Scripture and the inspiration of Scripture and the author of creation, they're going to have to do that. And I've found that time and time again. And so I am supremely confident of that. And that's what I want Christians to walk in, that kind of confidence, that they're just so convinced that God and his revelation are trustworthy, that they can go engage any topic and any person and rest in that confidence anchored in the truth and be able to share the gospel with the love that Jesus gives them.
Yeah. And what I love about that is that I really do feel that culturally we're in a place right now where people are very people do not want to be told, here's the right answer, here's how you should think. People want to listen to a conversation. People want to be able to ask a question, and people want to basically be able to think for themselves, which I think is a really, really good thing. And I think even Christians need to pay attention to that and be like, stop telling people, even though we're called to present the truth, but stop cramming things down people's throats as much as saying hey, come, let us reason together. Let's understand what isn't making sense for you and what questions you have and maybe what counterpoints that you have. And we can kind of it can kind of go back and forth both ways. In fact, that's kind of the next quest I want to embark on this channel, honestly, is, and I don't know the best way to do it yet, but it would be so cool to get, someone like you and someone who is not a believer, and it's where it's not a debate. It's more of, let's share notes, let's reason together, let's figure out, where is their agreement, where is their disagreement, why does each believe what they believe, and basically just have a long form conversation with believers and non-believers, or even, between even interfaith, right? Christians and Muslims, and just that idea of let's all talk it out and reason together and let the chips fall where they may, rather than kind of these separate silos of they're wrong, we're right. I just think there's so much value in basically having that conversation. And I also just see so much of Jesus in that, because, he didn't stay in his silo. He went out and he called us to go to the highways and byways, but he also went and had dinner with the tax collector. How dare you, even the prostitute, right? He would get down and so, that idea, Jesus, friend of sinners, and just, like you said, not being ashamed of the gospel, but also not being afraid to talk with people or even be corrected if we're getting, at whatever we're getting wrong, and just the humility to basically have the conversation. So I think that there's actually a really, really big need for that. And so, anyways, I'll reach out to Reasons to Believe in the future once I figure out the best way to do it. But anyways, I just appreciate your time so much today and everything that we talked about. You're right. We really ping ponged around in a lot of different directions, but It was great.
I like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. And if you ever do that, that opposing or not, differing opinions dialogue, I've been trying any chance I get to do that. I would love to do that because I think when it comes down to it, whenever understanding of any position, any set of positions is done, I think Christianity shines well in any kind of environment like that because I firmly believe it's the truth. So love to do it. Love what you're thinking about there. And again, just really enjoyed our conversation today.
If you enjoyed this conversation, you might also enjoy the Wisdom Society, a growing community of believers from around the world that meets weekly to discuss tough questions, to read scripture, and to pray. Within the Wisdom Society, there is also a book club where members are joined by the author of the book so that they can discuss the book directly with the author. Join today, support this channel, invest in yourself, grow in faith, connect with believers from around the world. Click the link in the description to find out more.